can't see this bit, but you see, obviously an official came to allow the photographer to take the picture, and he didn't realise his briefcase was in the foreground. Just look at the fear of that little boy looking at that briefcase. The devil was behind the camera. Again, the association of literacy is with enemy officials likely to take children into custody or care, something which happened regularly, in contrast to the fairy tale that gypsies steal children, something I explored in a recent article about the so-called blonde Maria, who Greek gypsies were accused of having stolen. In fact, she was albino, she had blue eyes and blonde hair, but people thought, oh, the gypsies have stolen her. I told the gypsies the nearest to the truth, namely that as a future teacher I needed to know about their way of life in the event of having gypsy pupils. I had no idea then I'd write a book, let alone a PhD. I would never knowingly betray this minority persecuted through centuries. Anthropology inspired because it offered the full range of alternative ways of living. I had pitched my tent, and in fact, oops, that's gone wrong now, that is. There were people living in tents 20 miles from London when I was doing fieldwork, and I got to know those people. But I knew I had to write notes. I did this privately late at night or in the local library. On my second site, my council trailer, unbeknown to me, that's the white one immediately under the tree, should have been burned according to mortuary rites because the previous resident had died in it. The caravan, therefore, was haunted by the ghost of the dead at night. So I was never disturbed when writing my field notes at night. Initially, I wrote according to preconceived categories such as kinship or occupation, but if themes were selected in advance, much is overlooked. Fortunately, Malcolm MacLeod, with fieldwork in Ghana, supervised by Evans Pritchard, gave the best advice. Write down everything you see, hear or smell. Ideally, you should complete an exercise book each day. Decades later, in re-examining my first month's narrative, I realised that hidden, but now in plain sight, were key themes later explored in my doctorate and monograph. The anthropologist cannot predict in-depth cultural understanding during or immediately after participation. The material has to be ruminated, then classified in relation to the literature on the people, others, and theories emerging around the globe. Thus, Levi-Strauss on totemism, Leach and Tambaya in Thailand all assisted in unmasking, for me, the latent code in gypsy animal classification, which appeared in that book. Eventually convinced of the value of fieldwork, my research manager arranged for my confidential field notes to be typed up by the centre's secretaries. Of course, it was fascinating work for them, and they were told not to discuss it in coffee breaks. But that's an example of the sort of typed up thing. I had all those wonderful facilities ready. I've outlined elsewhere the complex process of going through that. It's in an article, Thinking Through Fieldwork. I now explore comparisons and contrasts amongst other anthropologists. Some also faced accusations of espionage, though not in such threatening circumstances as I did. Paul Clow, on the left here, Anglo-American, in Nigeria, revealed the villagers in Hausaland were suspicious or confused by my taking notes. There was the rumour I was a government spy. They grew to like me. There was simply the assumption that I couldn't be spending so much time with them asking questions unless I was getting something out of it. They were sure I was writing down everything in order to take it to England and there make a huge profit. Carol Silverman, you see second from the right, she could not follow her original plans to do her doctorate on music making amongst Roma in Bulgaria because this music was banned under communism. Indeed, Bulgarian Roma were forbidden to speak Romani. There were horror stories of notes and recordings being confiscated at the customs. So Carol decided, having found out about this music in Bulgaria, she did her PhD on Roma in New York and then returned, as this photo shows, after the collapse of communism. This is the Japanese anthropologist Akira Okazaki, who fled Japan aged 19 to live with the Maasai, and there he said, "Me as a Moran," with the Maasai. He later returned years past for anthropological fieldwork amongst the Gamp in the Sudan. And note-taking interrupted his involvement. He wrote after key events. Usually the best and most interesting answer, he said, or discussion, is when we're doing a similar thing like walking or working. There's a problem. When you're moving, I cannot write. My memory is limited anyway. The exact word is important. There is another moment like rituals, because among the Gamp, they start talking almost 2 to 3 hours before making a final sacrifice. But tape recording was welcome. He said, "I attended so many times, I came to be known as harmless. Go on with your tape recorder," they said. I never asked questions. I was attending in the same style in front of the ancestors. It's hard to make notes in the field. One situation in which I couldn't make notes, but very urgently needed to put on paper, I just went to the toilet. Not because they rejected me writing, but I felt very awkward. People are talking about dreams. It is a different experience. They associated writing with documents and paper and IDs. But someone who can write is a very precious person, and I was asked, just please write down this, or I can't read this. So that kind of person might occupy, if he or she is up front, a power relationship. Felicia Hughes Freeland, I haven't got a picture, she studied in Indonesia. People always tell you the best things when you can't make notes. Usually you're on the back of a motorcycle, or in a storm up a mountain, or you've had your bag stolen. It's usually when you're not in a position to do anything except pay incredible attention as you hear it. You're already processing it into something you can understand. Immediately the words hit your ear. You were doing something to that information. Concentrating later on dance, Felicia said, I was sketching, always trying to find a way of drawing the movements. Fruitless, I got so many squiggles. By the end I was so tired. As the year progressed, I got more tired. I got better not doing anything, and that got me enormous approval. So some used notebooks and jotting. Helena Wolff on the left, her first fieldwork amongst South London teenagers. She used a typewriter. Some days I just wrote one sentence. It might take a few days before the next entry. I didn't hide my notes. I'd no place to hide them in this tiny bedsitter. Not that I wrote about anything that would have upset them, but to make sure I sometimes wrote in Swedish. Also, I might have misunderstood something I would be able to correct. There were some sensitive issues with the teenage girls, like glue sniffing, that I preferred to write in Swedish. One thing I learned from Ulf Hanners before I went to the field was jot down key words, even late at night. You forget when you sleep. When Wolff researched ballet in Stockholm, she kept a tiny notepad in her jeans, and like both Okazaki and myself, a visit to the toilet had added advantages for jotting down key words. Daniela Peluso, who I didn't interview but I recently got to know, she described her fieldwork in the Brazilian Amazon, and there is her darling little son she's leaning against. I carried a jot book where I jotted down a word that would jar my memory when I had a moment alone. I tried to break away every few hours, but there were days I had to wait until everyone was asleep. I didn't want them to see me write. It wasn't that. It was that I didn't want to miss a moment of reality. Peluso also consulted her son, Dimitri. He became a source of field notes or repository of information. I often asked him his version of particular events. His comments were always insightful. Nancy Lindisfarne, with the Pashtun nomads, believe it or not, in Afghanistan before the Russian invasion. Richard, her husband, she said, travelled a lot. I stayed put in this much more domestic setting, then eventually worked through genealogies and had very comprehensive records of people's histories of marriage, telling about tribal politics and wealth. I did it all the time. I got wrapping paper from the local bazaar and did my genealogies. I've only just found them again. They look like circuit diagrams. I did them in the tent. We use small notebooks. Camels carry trunks. So you buy trunks and then you have to be balanced on either side of the camel. We had trunks that carried rice and notebooks. Literacy, she said, was virtually non-existent. Our host was literate, but there was no privacy. We would stuff ourselves in a corner and write notes. Otherwise, we tended not to use notebooks. When talking to people, it's so intrusive. But using the excuse of language learning, there would be a word, then you could write down 2.5 facts at the same time. Most of the day we spent with people, but occasionally pulling out a notebook saying, that's a new word, and then we would be able to scribble something else as well. Louise de la Gorgendière, husking maize amongst the Asante in Ghana. I took my field notes on a stenographer's notepad, not shorthand, but short form, and in the evening diligently wrote up my notes every day. I stayed up till 2 o'clock in the morning doing it. Then I would set out questions or things that I had to examine the next day. She also wrote a diary, and she said that she realised that she was thinking, what on earth is going on? I'm useless, I'm hopeless, I don't know anything. But then she read the diary a few months later and realised that she began to understand. Anthony Howarth, no picture here, my current doctoral student at Cambridge, found no problem in writing notes in front of the Nepalese nomads, but his recent fieldwork amongst Irish travellers in the City of London, he said, was completely different. I didn't write anything down in front of them unless something couldn't wait. I would write field notes at the end of the day in my trailer. On a few occasions, travellers would visit me while I was doing this, and I'd put the journal aside. The head man, on seeing me, said, I want to read this book when you're finished. He was literate, to which I replied, I can't wait to hear what you think. He said, Anthony, if I'd constantly written things down, it would have been very difficult to establish trust. During my fieldwork, I kept one journal and everything in there, personal feelings, interpretations of the day's events. I also worked with men doing building. Here I did as they did and learned with the body to experience the city as near as possible to the way they did. This was a kind of knowing that was profound due to it being beyond linguistic interpretation. Just as Helena Wolff, Peluso, Lindisfarne and de la Gorgendière described, most anthropologists tried to write notes almost every day. Nancy Lindisfarne and Richard kept a diary of the day, every day. You can only write so much before typewriters before your hands fall off. But the diary notebooks had this important advantage. It anchored one's own feelings with what one was hearing, so that at all times the information collected on that day was also being fed through the gamut of experience that one had. So I suggest already this comment confirms the importance of unwritten lived experience. We also learn with our body. And there's a wonderful article in one of the books on field notes by Jean Jackson saying, "I am a field note." This is, I dropped the jump on. This is Hélène Neveu-Kringelbach. She is married to a Danish husband, so one of her children, the darling little third from the left, is looking Anglo-Saxon Danish. There is Hélène with her second child as well. She was Franco-Senegalese identity, studying dance in Senegal. She said, "I mostly wrote up my notes after the events on my own, or sometimes a few days later. I'd sit down and recall the events, write up accurately. Outside Dakar, I brought my notebooks just in case, not intending to use it, because I didn't usually write notes in front of people. In the dance world and in front of my friends, it wasn't appropriate, because it would have been like reminding them all the time that I was doing research." Johnny Parry, who had done years of fieldwork in India, described, and he took me up to show me his boxes and books of field notes. He said, "You have these thousands of pages of notes, but as you're writing, you find, oh, why didn't I ask that? Very often you find you've got a great deal of data you had no idea you got. In a very peculiar thing it is. I write the most perhaps absurdly detailed diaries. I've always found that one learns things from rereading that you didn't know that you knew. If I look back at my early Canberra notes, they were short and skimpy, because you were so bewildered you didn't know what to write. You couldn't understand half of what was going on. Whereas on a good day, the problem is to find time to do the writing. A day's notes from my Bilai fieldwork might be 15 typed A4 pages. Both with the Kangra and the Benares fieldwork, I wrote by hand. In India, you can buy leather-bound notebooks, and he produced one. He said, "This is from Benares." And I asked, "What does that mean on the top? 5925. He said, "Oh, that's 5,922. That's the number of the page." So you can see what kind of pages he has. Joanna Overing, studying the Pirayo in Venezuela. "Every night I copy down all my notes from the day. In copying them, you analyse or raise questions. And what you don't understand, you want to relate to. Also keeping things in various categories. Every single night I copy, even if we had tons of data on chant language. On working with the language, that's the only time you see gaps. Going around with a notepad depends. I took extensive notes during the day. The Pirao understood that, liked it. So again, with a non-literate group, it was fine for her to have a notebook. And I referred then in conversation to the wonderful example of Lévi-Strauss in Tristes Tropiques, where one of the chiefs takes his pen and imitates Lévi-Strauss to impress his people, i.e. the pen is a sign of power, even though the chief was just doing squiggles. The Pirawa, Joanna said, understood complicated symbolism. It's very graphic. They could see the patterns and they linked it to the patterns on their basketry, the paths of the song, very different designs. Overing said, "I have all these books on myths, language. It's still like looking for a needle in a haystack, because I'm looking for different things now." That's how I really learned Pirawa cosmology, by rereading these books. Those notebooks were absolutely essential. And of course, there's again the whole thing which I'll develop later, is how you get to know things, and you don't write them up when you've got to know the culture, or things change through time. And here's wonderful pictures of Margaret Kennard, which I reproduced in my volume, Anthropology and Autobiography. And on the left is Margaret with a sweet little boy sitting on her lap. On the right is that same little boy helping her push the boat out when she returned. So that shows the length of time. And she's got even more follow-up field work. Here is my former student, Tony Simpson, the one with the hat, of a Jamaican mother and white father who repeatedly returned to Zambia, where he did initial research on a boarding school of the future elite who he once taught. Here's a difference amongst the younger generation. He'd been given methods courses, but he was experimenting in different ways. He said, "The whole process of producing an ethnographic text is intriguing. Fieldwork is how we learn, but when we write up, it's almost as if we screen out the learning process. Perhaps this is because of the demands of journal editors or publishers. I see a real shift in my note-taking. When writing my PhD, I felt I had to, I was probably told, to write down everything. An impossible task, of course, how to record as much as possible of the imponderabilia of everyday life." And here, inadvertently, Malinowski is quoted, who asked us to look for the imponderabilia of everyday life. Tony said, "It's exhausting, I found, to plunge back into the diary, but it did prove extraordinarily useful as I discovered how much I'd forgotten, or more interestingly, how my memory of what had happened sometimes differed significantly from my contemporary recorded account. I found the video material even more revealing." The challenge is how to write and to keep faithful to this mountain of material, only a minute fraction of which will ever appear in an ethnographic text. Now I write far fewer notes. Is it because I'm lazy, more familiar, more confident? The notes, long or short, should always assist in our attempts to capture the lives of others and bear witness to these lives in as honest a fashion as possible. Then, just referring to the problems of the interview, Anna Maria Vilhanian, who was a contemporary of mine, and we were both studying Roma or Gypsies at the same time. We didn't get to know each other for years, but she was in Finland. She couldn't even find a supervisor who would agree to supervise her. That's the other thing, is people in my day, they said, I'm afraid Maurice Bloch said, we don't need to study Europe because we already know it. You know, that was just before the collapse of the Berlin Wall. Apparently we all knew that as well. Anyway, Anna Maria was advised to do interviewing, and she was so innocent, she realizes how. She started interviewing Roma women about childbirth. That is a polluting private event. The women just roared with laughter. Gradually, Anna Maria realized such topics were utterly taboo. Eventually, she found that she spent informal time with them and they accepted the discussions. But as often the case, they fully accepted her use of a tape recorder. That was the case in my situation, although I only later produced a tape recorder well into my field work. And that was when I was trusted. But the children were absolutely fascinated because they play it back and they hear their own voice and they'd start talking to themselves. Anyway, I did take the tape recorder in a sort of cloth bag over my shoulder and wandered around the site, not as it were being deceitful, but because I thought I must capture their way of speaking and their pronunciation, because I don't get this right in the text. And then I got back to my caravan and I found the tape recorder had blocked and stopped. And what was so fascinating, I couldn't remember a word of that 1 hour's discussion and time with people. I had turned off my internal tape recorder. So if you think life is easy, oh, you just go there, live there, have a laugh. I was internally taping everything before I could disappear into the haunted caravan and write up my field notes.